Imagine standing at the edge of a vast desert, where the wind carries whispers of a civilization lost to time. The Canaanites, these ancient people who thrived over 3,000 years ago in the lands we now call Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, held beliefs so strange and captivating that they might sound like something from a fantasy novel. Their gods weren't just distant figures in the sky. They were chaotic, unpredictable, and deeply tied to the rhythms of nature, war, and even the underworld. Picture a pantheon where deities demanded wild rituals, where sacrifices were made to gods of storms and serpents, and where the line between the divine and the monstrous was often blurred. This is the world of Canaanite religion, a realm of mystery and forgotten power waiting to be uncovered. The Canaanites didn't worship in grand temples like the Egyptians or the Greeks. Instead, their sacred spaces were often simple hilltop shrines or open-air altars, places where the boundary between earth and heaven felt thin. Their gods weren't just symbols of abstract ideals, they were forces of raw nature, embodying the fury of storms, the fertility of the land, and the terror of the unknown. These deities weren't always benevolent. Some demanded blood, while others presided over the shadowy realms of the dead. To understand the Canaanites is to step into a world where religion wasn't just about morality or philosophy. It was about survival, about pleading with the gods to spare your crops from drought or your city from invasion. Today, we're diving deep into this enigmatic pantheon, uncovering 30 of the most bizarre and fascinating gods worshipped by the Canaanites. From the storm god Baal, who roared with thunder and lightning, to the terrifying Mot, the god of death who devoured the living, each deity reveals a piece of this ancient civilization's soul. Some of these gods were worshipped for centuries, while others faded into obscurity, their names nearly erased by time. But their stories of power, betrayal, and divine drama still echo across the millennia. So buckle up, because we're about to journey into a world where gods walked among mortals, where rituals could mean the difference between life and death, and where the divine was as unpredictable as the desert wind. This is the untold story of the Canaanite gods, and trust me, you've never heard anything like it. At the very top of the Canaanite pantheon sat El, the ancient father of gods and men. Unlike the flashy, tempestuous deities beneath him, El embodied quiet authority, a gray-bearded sage whose wisdom shaped the cosmos itself. Imagine a deity so old his name simply meant God, a figure so fundamental that even rival cultures whispered it with reverence. His throne rested on sacred mountains, places where earth touched sky, and from there he presided over the delicate balance of the universe. This wasn't just some distant sky god. El was a creator in the most visceral sense, crafting the world from primordial chaos, then populating it with gods, monsters, and humankind. The Canaanites saw him as both king and patriarch, referring to him as Bull El, not just for strength, but for the life-giving power of a herd's progenitor. His consort, Asherah, represented fertility, but it was El who set the stars in motion and decreed the fates of mortals. What's fascinating is how his influence rippled far beyond Canaan. The Sumerians worshipped a similar sky father, Anu, while later cultures like the Phoenicians carried echoes of El into the Mediterranean world. Even the Israelites, who famously rejected Canaanite gods, still used his name in early scriptures, El Shaddai, El Elyon, phrases that lingered like shadows of a forgotten empire. Yet El wasn't all benevolence. Canaanite myths describe him as cunning, occasionally withdrawn, letting younger gods like Baal clash for power while he observed from his mountain throne. His stories are less about thunderous miracles and more about the quiet inevitability of time, how even gods must yield to cycles of decay and renewal. That duality, gentle creator and detached ruler, makes him one of history's most intriguing supreme beings. If El was the wise old ruler of the Canaanite pantheon, Baal was the thunderous rebel, the storm god whose very name sent lightning cracking across the sky. Unlike his distant father, Baal didn't sit quietly on a mountaintop. He rode the tempest, smiting chaos with a warrior's fury. This was no aloof deity, but a god of raw, pulsing energy, one who commanded both the life-giving rains and the destructive power of hurricanes. His myths were less about order and more about the wild, untamed forces that shaped the world. At the heart of Baal's legend was his epic battle against Yam, the serpentine god of the sea. Imagine the clash: a storm god hurling lightning against a primordial ocean, each strike a defiant roar against the abyss. To the Canaanites, this wasn't just myth, it was reality reflected in their world. Every year, drought threatened their crops, and every winter, floods swallowed their land. Baal's victory over Yam wasn't just a story. It was a promise that order would triumph over chaos, that the rains would return, that life would endure. His temples, like the grand sanctuary at Ugarit, were built as cosmic reflections of his power. Archaeologists have uncovered altars stained with offerings, grain, wine, and sometimes blood, pleas for his favor in a world where survival hung on the whims of the weather. Farmers worshipped him as fervently as kings, for Baal's storms didn't distinguish between palace and field. Even his consort, the warrior goddess Anat, embodied this duality, she who could slaughter armies yet also wept over Baal's seasonal descent into the underworld, a myth that mirrored the death and rebirth of crops. Yet Baal's legacy took a dark turn as new religions rose. The Hebrews, once neighbors to the Canaanites, recast him as a demon Baal-zebub, lord of the flies, a malevolent trickster. To them, his wild, untamed nature was a threat to their strict monotheism. Centuries later, even early Christians would echo this disdain, painting him as a prince of hell. But strip away the demonization, and you'll find a god who wasn't evil, just fiercely alive, a symbol of nature's uncontrollable beauty and brutality. That's the tragedy of Baal. A deity once hailed as the giver of life became a footnote in sermons about sin. Yet in the ruins of Ugarit, when the summer storms roll in off the Mediterranean, you can almost hear the old prayers rising again. The distant echo of a people who knew the gods weren't just kind or cruel, but as untamed as the wind itself. While El ruled from the mountaintop and Baal roared with the storms, Asherah wove life itself into the fabric of Canaan. She wasn't just a consort or a passive mother figure. She was the earth's heartbeat, the force that made fields flourish and wombs quicken. Picture groves of ancient trees, their trunks wrapped in linen, their branches heavy with votive offerings. This was Asherah's domain, a living temple where her presence pulsed in every root and leaf. Her symbols were as visceral as her power. Poles carved from sacred wood stood in shrines across Canaan, representations of her connection to both the divine and the earthly. Archaeologists have unearthed countless clay figurines, curved women clutching their breasts, their wide hips embodying fertility itself. These weren't mere decorations, they were prayers in clay, meant to invoke Asherah's blessing on homes and harvests. But here's where her story twists. Asherah's worship didn't stay confined to Canaan. Fragments of pottery from Kuntalit-Ajrud, a remote desert outpost, bear inscriptions that still stir debates among scholars, to Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. The phrasing is explosive. It suggests that early Israelites, even as they revered Yahweh, might have also honored Asherah as his divine partner. Was she once seen as Yahweh's consort, much like she was El's? The evidence is tantalizing, if controversial. Later biblical texts rage against her. Prophets condemn the Asherah poles, tearing them down as idols, and kings like Josiah purge her worship from the temple. What began as reverence devolved into heresy, her name scrubbed from orthodoxy. Yet even in exile, her legacy endured. Some scholars trace echoes of her in the Bible's personified wisdom, in the whispered prayers of midwives, in the stubborn survival of sacred groves long after the priests had left. Asherah's tale is one of erasure and resilience. A goddess who nourished nations became a footnote in someone else's scripture. but dig beneath the dust of history and you'll find her rooted deep like the trees she loved, refusing to be forgotten. Now meet Anat, Canaan's goddess of war, whose very name sent chills down the spines of both mortals and gods. This wasn't some distant strategic deity. Anat reveled in the chaos of battle, her hands perpetually stained with blood. Myths describe her wading knee-deep in the gore of her enemies, grinning as she decapitated warriors and hung their heads from her belt like trophies. Yet for all her savagery, Anat carried a paradoxical title, the Virgin, not because she shunned passion, but because her ferocity made her untouchable, a force too wild to be bound by marriage or convention. Her most infamous legend unfolds after Baal's defeat by Mot, the god of death. While others mourned, Anat didn't weep, she hunted. She tracked Mot to the underworld, and in a scene that would make even the bravest warrior blanch, she hacked him apart with a ritual knife, winnowing his corpse like grain, scattering his flesh for birds to eat. This wasn't just vengeance, it was a sacred act. By tearing death itself to pieces, she cleared the way for Baal's resurrection, proving that even the cycle of mortality could be shattered by sheer will. Strange as it sounds, Anat's bloodlust had purpose. Like a storm cleansing the land, her violence wasn't mindless, it was a reset button for the cosmos. Farmers invoked her to protect their fields from locusts, and kings begged her favor before war, knowing her rage could turn the tide. Yet she wasn't just Canaan's Sekhmet. The Egyptian lioness goddess embodied plague and healing, but Anat, she had no healing side. Her power was pure, unfiltered destruction. A reminder that creation sometimes requires annihilation first. What's haunting is how her worship lingered in unexpected places. Centuries later, Phoenician sailors carried her cult as far as Carthage, where she merged with local deities, her name whispered before naval battles. Even in the Bible, echoes of Anat survive not in praise but in condemnation. The prophet Jeremiah rails against worship in the high places, where offerings were made to a queen of heaven, some scholars link to her. A goddess once feared became a cautionary tale, her altars smashed, her stories rewritten. But in the dusty fragments of Ugaritic tablets, Anat still fights, her laughter ringing across the battlefield, a divine tempest who refused to be tamed. Beneath the towering myths of storm gods and warrior goddesses, Dagon quietly nourished the Canaanite world, a deity whose power grew not from thunder or bloodshed but from the golden sway of wheat fields. This was no distant sky god. Dagon's realm was the soil itself, the crunch of harvested grain between fingers, the scent of warm bread rising from clay ovens. His name might mean corn or grain in ancient Semitic tongues, yet his influence stretched far beyond the harvest. Temples dedicated to him rose in cities like Ugarit, where farmers and kings alike kneeled before altars heaped with the first fruits of the season, praying for abundance in a land where famine lurked like a shadow. What makes Dagon truly fascinating is his duality. Some depictions show him with a fish's tail, a symbol so striking it led later cultures like the Philistines to reimagine him as a maritime deity. Archaeologists still debate whether this was literal or metaphorical. Was the fish tail an allusion to the life-giving waters that nourished crops, or did it hint at a deeper connection to the primordial sea, tying him to older Mesopotamian gods like Enki, the lord of freshwater? Either way, Dagon's iconography blurred boundaries between earth and water, fertility and mystery. Then there's the biblical twist. The Book of Judges tells of Samson, the Hebrew hero, who topples a Philistine temple of Dagon after his infamous haircut saps his strength. The story paints Dagon as a false god, his statue crumbling before Yahweh's power. But dig deeper, and the narrative reveals cultural tensions, how the Philistines, possibly borrowing Dagon from Canaanite tradition, clashed with Israelite monotheism. It's a rare glimpse of how gods became pawns in larger wars of identity. Dagon's worship didn't stop at Canaan's borders. Tablets from Mari, an ancient Mesopotamian city, invoke him as a judge of the dead. In Ebla, he was a national god, his cult so entrenched that kings bore names honoring him. This wasn't just a farmer's deity. Dagon's roots ran deep, anchoring communities to the land while his symbolism evolved across empires. Even when later cultures absorbed him, they couldn't strip away his essence, the quiet, relentless promise that as long as seeds broke open in the dark earth, there would be life. If Baal was the storm and Asherah the earth, then Resheph was the silent terror that crept through Canaanite cities in the dead of night, a god who didn't need thunder to make mortals tremble. Armed with a quiver of invisible arrows, he struck without warning, his name whispered in the same breath as fever, boils, and sudden death. Unlike the dramatic clashes of other deities, Resheph's power was intimate, insidious. One day, a child would play in the marketplace. The next, their skin would burn with unseen fire. This wasn't just myth. Archaeologists have found amulets etched with his likeness buried beneath doorways, desperate attempts to ward off his arrows. His temples weren't grand halls but shadowy shrines where offerings of incense and bitter herbs rose like pleas into the air. Yet Resheph wasn't solely a bringer of suffering. In a paradox common to ancient gods, he also held the cure. Texts from Ugarit describe rituals where priests invoked him to end plagues, bargaining with the archer to lower his bow. His duality mirrors Mesopotamia's Nergal, who wielded pestilence but also guarded the gates of the underworld, a reminder that gods of destruction often held the keys to salvation, if only you knew how to ask. Enter Horon, Resheph's shadowy counterpart. Where Resheph shot arrows, Horon whispered spells. A master of the underworld's darkest arts, he didn't just rule the dead, he weaponized their secrets. Canaanite magicians scrawled his name on lead curses, binding enemies with words as sharp as Resheph's arrows. Imagine a farmer, desperate to protect his herd, burying a tablet inscribed with Horon's incantations to repel the evil eye or a demon's touch. His power wasn't in grandeur but in the unseen, the flicker of a candle at midnight, the murmur of names best left unspoken. The kinship between these two gods reveals a chilling truth about Canaanite belief. Survival meant negotiating with forces you couldn't control. Resheph brought the plague, but Horon's magic might stop it. Together, they echoed Mesopotamia's Nergal and Ereshkigal, the king and queen of the underworld who balanced destruction with order. Yet Horon had a twist. While Ereshkigal ruled passively over the dead, Horon acted. His spells didn't just comfort, they attacked. A soldier might wear his amulet into battle, trusting Horon to turn enemy blades aside, while a mother tucked his symbol beneath her child's bed to silence restless ghosts. What's haunting is how their cults outlived canon. Resheph appears in Egyptian hieroglyphs as a war god adopted by pharaohs, his arrows now metaphorically defending borders. Horon's incantations resurfaced in Jewish magical texts centuries later, his name distorted but his power still feared. These gods never truly died, they just learned new tongues. To worship them was to admit a hard truth that the world was filled with invisible arrows and whispered curses, and the only shield was a god who knew the dark as well as you did. While the gods of canon wielded thunder and commanded armies, Kothar-wa-Khasis worked miracles of a different kind. His power lay not in destruction but in creation forged by fire. Picture the glow of a divine workshop, where hammers rang against anvils shaping weapons that could split mountains and palaces that touched the stars. This was the realm of the ultimate craftsman, whose very name meant skillful and wise, a title earned through breathtaking ingenuity. Unlike the tempestuous gods around him, Kothar operated in the realm of precision. When Baal needed a weapon to slay the sea god Yam, it was Kothar who forged Yagrush and Ima, two mythic clubs with names meaning chaser and driver, tools so potent they could shatter primordial chaos. The texts describe him laughing as he worked, whispering secret names into the molten metal, imbuing each strike with magic. His workshop wasn't just a physical space, it was a crossroads of cultures. Some legends place it in Kafta, possibly Crete, while others claim Memphis, linking him to Egypt's Ptah, another god who sculpted the world with his hands. The parallels don't stop there. Like Hephaestus in Greek myths, Kothar was the outsider whose brilliance outshone his peers. While Olympians mocked Hephaestus for his limp, Canaanite myths hint that Kothar's wisdom set him apart. His knowledge of hidden languages and celestial blueprints made him indispensable. He didn't just build, he envisioned. When El ordered a palace for Baal, Kothar designed it with a roof that opened for rain, a touch so ingenious it blurred the line between architecture and divine will. Yet Kothar's legacy stretches beyond myth. Archaeologists have found ivory carvings and bronze ritual tools inscribed with motifs that mirror his symbols, evidence that real-world artisans saw him as their patron. In a world where craftsmanship meant survival, Kothar was the unseen hand guiding the chisel, the kiln, the loom. His genius wasn't just in making things, but in revealing how creation itself could be a form of worship. What's striking is how his influence seeped into later traditions. The Phoenicians, inheritors of Canaanite culture, carried his essence into their glassmaking and shipbuilding, while Hebrew scribes wove echoes of his skill into the construction of Solomon's temple. Kothar never demanded blood or thunderous praise. His power was quieter, etched into the very bones of civilization. To wield a hammer in his name was to touch the divine. Shapash burned as the silent witness of Canaan, her light piercing both the deeds of mortals and the secrets of gods. Unlike the fierce, masculine sun deities of neighboring cultures like Mesopotamia's Shamash, who wielded solar power like a judge's gavel, Shapash operated in subtler shades. Her epithet, Torch of the Gods, wasn't just poetic flair. It captured her dual role as illuminator and psychopomp, guiding souls through the labyrinth of the underworld with the same steady glow she cast over living fields. Imagine her as the celestial mediator, her rays exposing truths in divine disputes where even Baal and El hesitated to strike the final blow. Her most haunting duty unfolded in the myth of Baal's death. When Mot, the god of decay, swallowed Baal whole, plunging the world into drought, it was Shapash who descended into the abyss, not with Anat's bloody vengeance but with quiet persistence. Her light became a bridge between realms, coaxing Mot to relent, her warmth softening the edges of death itself. This wasn't just symbolism. To the Canaanites, the sun's summer zenith marked Baal's resurrection, and Shapash's journey mirrored the fragile hope that light would always return. Justice flowed through her like heat waves. Ugaritic texts describe her revealing omens to kings, her position in the sky signaling divine favor or warning. A solar eclipse wasn't just an astronomical event. It was Shapash turning her face away, a silent indictment of human failing. Unlike Shamash, who presided over law codes, Shapash's justice was intuitive, woven into the fabric of daily life. Farmers read her light for planting seasons, sailors traced her path for navigation, and mourners whispered prayers for her to light the way for their loved ones in the afterlife. What's striking is her endurance. While male sun gods dominated neighboring pantheons, Shapash's femininity refracted her power differently, less about domination, more about revelation. Even in artifacts, she's depicted with a solar disk cradled like a child, a nod to her life giving warmth rather than punitive glare. Later cultures would borrow fragments of her essence. The Phoenicians merged her with Astarte, while Hebrew psalms echoed her role as a guide in darkness. But in the Canaanite imagination, she remained irreducible, a goddess who didn't just shine but saw, her light laying bare the hidden threads binding heaven, earth, and the world below. While the sun blazed across Canaanite skies, Yarikh cast a softer glow, a silver god whose phases dictated the rhythms of life itself. Unlike the dramatic storms of Baal or the scorching gaze of Shapash, Yarikh's power pulsed in the quiet, the ebb and flow of tides, the slow turn of months, the sacred dance of time. His very name meant moon, and to the Canaanites that wasn't just a celestial body. It was a divine scribe etching fate into the night. Farmers planted seeds according to his waxing, sailors charted courses by his light, and priests deciphered omens in the shadows that crept across his face. Yarikh's most enchanting myth isn't one of battles but of love. Ancient tablets sing of his courtship of Nickel, a goddess whose name meant Great Lady, likely borrowed from Mesopotamian traditions. Their union wasn't just poetic, it was cosmic alchemy. Nickel, associated with orchards and abundance, brought fertility to Yarikh's cool light, intertwining the cycles of the moon with the fruiting of pomegranates and figs. The marriage hymn, preserved in cuneiform, is one of humanity's oldest surviving love songs, its lyrics pleading, "May Yarikh make your fields flourish, may Nickel shower you with sweetness." This wasn't just myth, it was a ritual blueprint. Couples sought blessings under the first crescent moon, believing Yarikh's union mirrored their own potential for prosperity. But Yarikh's influence went deeper than romance. His phases structured the Canaanite calendar. New moons marked sacred days, eclipses signaled divine displeasure, and full moons lit harvest festivals. At Kotharat, archaeologists uncovered lunar-shaped amulets buried with the dead, talismans meant to guide souls through the darkness, just as Yarikh guided travelers. His duality, gentle illuminator and keeper of secrets, made him a god of both revelry and revelation. Yet here's the twist: Yarikh wasn't unique to Canaan. From Mesopotamia's Sin to Egypt's Thoth, moon gods often held roles as scribes and timekeepers. What set Yarikh apart was his intimacy. While others ruled from cosmic distances, he was woven into daily life, his light filtering through olive branches, his phases dictating when to weave, when to reap, when to mourn. Even as empires rose and fell, Yarikh endured. Hebrew texts later condemned moon worship, but echoes lingered: the Sabbath's timing, the festival of Sukkot, all tied to lunar cycles. The moon god's legacy wasn't erased, it was absorbed, a silent rhythm beating beneath the surface of history. To stand beneath a Canaanite sky tracing Yarikh's path was to understand a world where time wasn't linear but cyclical. Where love and harvests, life and death, all moved to the silent turning of a silver wheel in the dark. Among the gods of Canaan, none embodied the terror of the unknown like Mot and Yam, twin forces of chaos who threatened to unravel the fragile order of the world. Mot, whose very name meant death, wasn't just a grim reaper lurking in the shadows. He was an all-consuming void, a deity whose hunger could never be satisfied. Myths describe his jaws stretching wide enough to swallow Baal whole, his throat a black pit where even gods could vanish without a trace. Unlike the gentle afterlife promised by some religions, Mot's realm offered no peace, only an eternal, gnawing emptiness. His presence wasn't confined to the underworld, it crept into the living world through drought, famine, and the silent rot of unchecked decay. When Mot rose, crops withered, kings fell, and even the bravest warriors felt their bones turn brittle with fear. But Mot wasn't alone in his reign of chaos. Yam, the serpentine god of the sea, ruled the opposite extreme, an untamed force of watery destruction. Picture a coiled leviathan, his scales glinting like storm-tossed waves, his voice the roar of a tempest crashing against the shore. Unlike the life-giving Nile or the predictable tides of later myths, Yam was pure, unfiltered chaos, an abyss that refused boundaries. Where Mot consumed, Yam drowned, dragging cities beneath his frothing waves without warning. The Canaanites knew the sea's treachery firsthand. Their coastal cities lived under constant threat of floods and typhoons, and Yam became the personification of that existential dread. What makes these gods so compelling is their role in the chaos camp, the ancient Near East's recurring theme of cosmic battle between order and chaos. Baal's legendary fights against Yam and Mot weren't just thrilling tales, they were sacred metaphors for survival. When Baal defeated Yam, splitting the sea monster's skull with his sacred clubs, it mirrored the annual struggle against floods and storms. Victory meant another year of fertile soil, not suffocating brine. His eventual descent into Mot's gullet, followed by his resurrection, mirrored the agonizing cycle of dry seasons giving way to rains. These myths didn't just entertain, they explained why the world teetered on the edge of catastrophe and why divine intervention was the only hope to push back the dark. Echoes of this struggle ripple across neighboring cultures. The Babylonian god Marduk slaying Tiamat, the Hebrews Yahweh crushing Leviathan, each reflects the same primal fear of chaos and the desperate need for a divine champion. Yet Canon's version stands apart. Unlike Tiamat, who is fully annihilated, or Leviathan, who awaits an apocalyptic battle, Yam and Mot are never truly destroyed. They retreat, simmering beneath the surface, ensuring the fight must be waged again and again. This wasn't pessimism, it was realism. The Canaanites understood chaos couldn't be erased, only held at bay, season after season, through ritual, sacrifice, and the fragile grace of their gods. Mot and Yam's legacy lingers in the unspoken fears of the modern world. The sudden disaster, the unstoppable force, the creeping dread of mortality. Their myths remind us that order is never guaranteed. It's a fleeting victory, hard-won and easily lost. And in that tension between the fragile light and the hungry dark, the Canaanites found not just stories, but the very meaning of their existence. Kotharat's realm stretched far beyond the fertile groves and hilltop shrines. Her power also pulsed through the restless waves of the Mediterranean. In Ugaritic texts, she emerges as the Lady of the Sea, a title that transforms her from a motherly earth goddess into something far more enigmatic. Picture her standing on the shore, her robes swirling like foam, her voice the whisper of tides pulling sailors toward uncharted horizons. This wasn't just poetic imagery. For coastal Canaanites, Kotharat was the difference between safe harbor and shipwreck. Fishermen carved her name into oars, and merchants buried amulets bearing her likeness in the sand before voyages, begging her to calm the storms that Yam, the chaotic sea god, might unleash. Her maritime role reveals a fascinating duality. While Asherah's earthly aspect nurtured crops, Kotharat of the sea guarded the lifeblood of trade and survival. Ugaritic myths depict her as El's consort, yes, but also as a mediator between realms, her foot resting on the shore, one hand dipped into the abyss. Ritual texts describe offerings of silver and shells poured into the waves in her name, a tangible exchange for safe passage. The Phoenicians, those master navigators, likely inherited this devotion, blending Kotharat into their own goddess Tanit, who later ruled Carthage harbors. The link is uncanny. Both goddesses were called Lion Lady, their symbols merging feline ferocity with the sea's untamed grace. Iconography deepens the mystery. A 13th century BCE ivory panel from Megiddo shows a robed goddess flanked by lions, her curls mirroring the waves, possibly Kotharat in her marine aspect. Even her epithets blur boundaries. Qudshu, the Holy One, painted her as both nurturer and tempest, but it's her possible connection to the biblical Ashtoreth that sparks debate. Some scholars argue the Old Testament conflated Kotharat with other deities, her maritime power distorted into idolatry. Yet in the ruins of Sidon and Tyre, archaeologists find altars where sailors once knelt, not to a demonized figure, but to a goddess who held the horizon in her hands. Kotharat's legacy is a tide that refuses to recede. Long after Canon faded, her presence lingered in the figureheads of Phoenician ships, in the whispered prayers of Mediterranean women tossing offerings into the surf. To worship her was to acknowledge that the sea, like the soil, was a giver and taker of life, and only a goddess who straddled both worlds could truly understand its secrets. Pidray crackled through Canaanite myth like a fleeting summer storm, a goddess who carried lightning in her hands and dew on her breath. While Baal roared with thunder, his daughter danced in the aftermath, her presence sharp and shimmering. Her very name, Pidray, may stem from a root meaning to flash, an apt title for a deity who embodied both the sudden brilliance of a lightning strike and the gentle, life-giving moisture that followed. The Canaanites didn't just worship her, they wove her into poetry, calling her the daughter of mist and the light of the heavens, epithets that blurred the line between the divine and the natural world. Unlike Anat's blood-soaked battles or Asherah's maternal grandeur, Pidray's power was subtle yet vital. She appeared in myths as one of Baal's 3 daughters, alongside Tale, the goddess of rain, and Arse, the goddess of earth. Together, they formed a triad of elemental forces, but Pidray stood apart. Her lightning wasn't just destructive, it was transformative. Farmers whispered her name when storm clouds gathered, knowing her flashes could split the sky, but also bless their fields with the dew that revived parched soil. In a land where water meant survival, Pidray's duality made her indispensable. Her myths are sparse but vivid. One fragment describes her as a bride, adorned in jewels that mirrored the stars, her veil woven from the first light of dawn. This wasn't mere romanticism. It reflected the Canaanite belief that lightning, like a bride's radiance, was both awe-inspiring and fleeting. Another text hints at her role in Baal's resurrection myth, her lightning bolts piercing the gloom of Mot's underworld like signals from the living. Unlike the Greek Zeus, who wielded lightning as a weapon, or the Norse Thor, whose hammer summoned storms, Pidray's electricity carried a quieter promise, renewal hidden within the chaos. Comparisons to other weather spirits reveal how unique she was. The Mesopotamian goddess Shalim oversaw grain and storms but lacked Pidray's poetic mystique. The Hittite Tahana shared Baal's thunderous traits, but his daughters never gleamed with the same delicate ferocity. Even the Hindu goddesses of lightning, like Indrani, leaned more toward marital symbolism than Pidray's balance of destruction and nurture. What's haunting is how her legacy flickered out. Later cultures reduced weather gods to mere forces of nature, stripping away their individuality. But in the Canaanite imagination, Pidray was more than a spark. She was the moment before the rain, the hush between thunderclaps, the dew-kissed dawn after a storm. A goddess who proved even the briefest light could leave the world changed. The Kotharat moved through Canaanite myth like whispers in a birthing chamber, 7 goddesses whose hands cradled the threshold between life and destiny. Unlike solitary deities of childbirth found in other cultures, these divine midwives worked as a chorus, their power multiplied by their sacred number. Texts from Ugarit depict them hovering over newborns, spinning threads of fate as delicate as umbilical cords. Their very presence a promise that survival was possible even in a world where childbirth could be as deadly as battle. Their rituals were woven into the fabric of daily life. Before weddings, couples would scatter 7 grains of barley, 1 for each Kotharat, while chanting incantations etched into clay tablets. Let the Kotharat come, let them count the months, let them watch over the child in darkness. These weren't just prayers, they were contracts with the divine, bargaining for safe passage through pregnancy's perilous journey. Archaeologists have found amulets carved with 7 dots or stars buried beneath house floors, likely placed by expectant mothers seeking the goddess's protection. What's haunting is their celestial twin, the Pleiades. This star cluster, known as the 7 Sisters across cultures, mirrored the Kotharat's number and purpose. Just as the Pleiades marked the agricultural calendar with their rising and setting, the Kotharat measured human time. Their arrival signaled conception's safety, their departure, the peril of birth's final hour. A fragmentary hymn describes them descending like doves to a newborn's bedside, their wings brushing against the infant's first breath. The surviving incantations reveal their dual nature. One tablet from Ugarit implores, "Kotharat, sharpen your knives," not as a threat but a plea. The knives, here are the sharp cries of labor, the pain that precedes life. Another text warns against offending them, lest they weave the months awry, twisting pregnancy into tragedy. Their power wasn't gentle, it was raw and exacting, demanding reverence. Comparisons to other birth deities only deepen their mystery. The Egyptians had Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess who bared her teeth against demons, while the Greeks worshipped Eileithyia, a singular birth goddess. But the Kotharat weren't protectors or guides, they were custodians of fate itself. To invoke them was to acknowledge that every birth was a gamble, and only these 7 could tilt the scales toward life. Even as monotheism swept the region, traces of the Kotharat lingered. Jewish folklore later spoke of 7 midwives of the soul attending each birth, and in some Arabic traditions the Pleiades were called al-Thureya, linked to fertility. The goddesses never truly faded, they just folded into new stories, their sevenfold presence a silent vigil over every cry that split the midnight air. Shahar and Shalim rose and fell like the breath of the Canaanite world, twin gods who painted the sky in strokes of gold and violet, their rhythms as predictable as the tides and as sacred as prayer. Shahar, dawn, wasn't just the herald of daylight, he was the moment the horizon caught fire, his chariot wheels scattering the last stars as he raced across the heavens. Shalim, dusk, moved with opposite grace, his arrival a sigh, his presence a lullaby that coaxed the world into shadows. Together, they weren't just bookends of the day. They embodied the Canaanite belief that time itself was a circle, each sunset a promise of another dawn, each dawn a reprieve from the chaos of night. Their myths pulse with quiet drama. Ugaritic texts describe Shahar's birth as a celestial event, El, the high god, declaring him, the one who lights the corners of the earth, his rays piercing even the underworld's gloom. Shalim's genesis was equally profound, but where his brother blazed, he soothed. His name resonates in the Hebrew word shalom, meaning peace, a linguistic ghost that hints at his enduring influence. Some scholars trace the very name Jerusalem to Shalim, suggesting the city's earliest roots may have honored this god of twilight, its streets built to catch the last amber light of his descent. What's striking is how these twins mirror and yet subvert other divine pairs. In Egypt, Horus and Set represented opposing forces locked in eternal struggle, but Shahar and Shalim were collaborators, their duality harmonious. Unlike the Greek Helios who followed the sun's journey or Hindu Ushers, a lone dawn goddess, the Canaanites saw the days turning as a delicate handoff between brothers. Rituals honored their balance, morning offerings of honey and saffron for Shahar, evening libations of wine and myrrh for Shalim, each gift a tribute to the precision of their dance. Archaeology offers tantalizing clues. A bronze plaque from ancient Lachish shows 2 male figures flanking a tree of life, one radiant, the other cloaked, possibly the twins guarding the axis of existence. Even their animal symbols spoke volumes, Shahar's falcon mirroring Horus's solar might, and Shalim's serpent, echoing Mesopotamian associations with twilight's mystery. Their legacy lingers in the quietest corners of culture. The Jewish evening prayer Mariv invokes Shalim's essence of peace, while early Christian hymns adapted dawn imagery from Shahar's lore. These gods never roared like Baal or demanded blood like Anat, but their constancy made them indispensable. To worship them was to confess a truth as old as humanity, that light and dark aren't enemies but partners in the endless work of renewal. Nickel's sweetness perfumed the Canaanite world like ripe fruit splitting open in the sun, a goddess whose very presence made orchards tremble with abundance. While Yarikh, the moon god, measured time in silver cycles, his beloved Nickel turned those rhythms into life, her fingers tracing the blossoms of pomegranates and figs until they swelled with nectar. Her roots stretched back to Sumer, where she was worshipped as Ningal, the great lady, weeping beside her husband Nana during the lunar eclipses that shook Mesopotamia. By the time her cult reached Canaan, she'd shed some of that melancholy, but never lost her raw, aching connection to growth and decay. The surviving hymns to Nickel are some of history's most tender religious texts. One Ugaritic tablet, scratched with cuneiform in the 13th century BCE, captures her voice pleading with Yarikh. Let the vines drink deep, let the dates drip gold, let your light linger on my boughs. This wasn't just poetry, it was liturgy. Farmers recited these lines during the first moon of harvest, their hands sticky with fruit pulp as they offered Nickel the ripest clusters. Unlike the blood-soaked rituals of Anat or the thunderous sacrifices to Baal, Nickel's worship was sensual, almost intimate. Priestesses wove garlands of almond blossoms for her statues, and newlyweds buried date pits beneath their bedposts, praying for fertility as tangible as the orchard she blessed. Her role in Ugaritic love poetry reveals how deeply she blurred sacred and earthly desire. A fragmentary tablet describes Yarikh stealing into her grove under a honeyed moon, their union making the trees shiver with fruit. The imagery wasn't just romantic, it was agricultural magic. Canaanites saw sex and harvest as mirroring acts, both requiring the right balance of moisture, heat, and divine favor. Spring festivals reenacted their marriage, with young girls wearing crowns of jasmine, their dances mimicking the wind stirring through branches, yet Nickel's gentleness held teeth. The same hymn that praised her sweetness also warned of her absence. If Nickel turns her face, the roots will crack thirsting, the bees will starve in the dust. This duality, nurturer and withholder, made her indispensable. Unlike Demeter, whose wrath brought eternal winter, Nickel's punishments were subtle but devastating, fruit rotting on the branch, blossoms withering before pollination. To worship her was to admit that even the most tender beauty demanded reverence. Archaeology confirms her reach. At Tel Hazer, a cache of bronze pomegranate amulets was found near an ancient winepress, each engraved with Nickel's name. Inscriptions from Byblos suggest Phoenician traders carried her cult as far as Cyprus, where she merged with local garden deities. Even the biblical Song of Songs echoes her imagery, the orchard of pomegranates, the fragrance of blooming vines, proof that her essence outlasted the Pantheon's fall. Nickel's legacy isn't in grand temples or thunderous myths, but in the quiet miracle of a tree heavy with fruit, in the old farmer's habit of whispering thanks before the first bite. She reminds us that divinity isn't always about power. Sometimes it's about patience, the slow unfurling of petals under a lover's light. Eshmon's story begins in blood and ends in rebirth, a god who carved his own body to gift humanity the secret of healing. Unlike the distant, all-powerful deities of Canaan's pantheon, Eshmon's power sprang from sacrifice, his myth as visceral as the scalpels used in his sanctuaries. Phoenician texts from Sidon whisper of his origins, a young hunter beloved of the goddess Astrono, who pursued him with such fervor that he severed his own genitals to escape her grasp. But this wasn't just a tragic act, it was alchemy. As his lifeblood soaked the earth, the gods transformed Eshmon into a divine physician, his suffering becoming the key to curing mortal wounds. His sanctuaries were laboratories of faith and science. The temple complex at Sidon, rediscovered in the 19th century, boasted sacred pools where pilgrims bathed in waters mixed with herbs and honey, their bodies anointed by priests who wore amulets carved with Eshmon's serpent staff. Sound familiar? The Greeks would later adopt this very symbol for Asclepius, but centuries before Hippocrates, Eshmon's healers practiced a blend of ritual and remedy. Excavations revealed bronze lancets and votive offerings shaped like afflicted body parts, clay livers, stone eyes, even tiny silver limbs left by the desperate and grateful. These weren't just superstitious trinkets, they were snapshots of real pain and hope, a dialogue between mortal suffering and divine intervention. The parallels to other healing gods reveal Eshmon's uniqueness. While Egypt's Thoth healed with magic spells and Mesopotamia's Gula relied on incantations, Eshmon's cures demanded participation. Patients slept in his temples, a baton, a sacred dormitory where dreams became diagnoses. A feverish child might wake to find a priest grinding willow bark into bitter tea, a primitive aspirin, while whispering Eshmon's name. His resurrection myth cemented his role. Just as he'd returned from self-destruction, so too could the body regenerate if given the right tools and divine grace. But Eshmon's legacy wasn't confined to Sidon. Phoenician sailors carried his cult to Carthage, where he merged with local gods, his temples rising beside harbors as beacons for the sick. A stele from the 4th century BCE shows a robed Eshmon holding a serpent, flanked by worshippers bearing jars of medicinal herbs. Even the Romans, who usually crushed foreign deities under Jupiter's heel, let his worship persist, rebranding him as Aesculapius's eastern cousin. What's haunting is how his myth prefigured medical truths. Castration, once a symbol of loss, became ironic foreshadowing modern endocrinology proves hormonal balance can heal. His serpent staff, mocked as pagan trickery, now twists around ambulances worldwide. Eshmon's greatest miracle wasn't resurrection. It was relevance, his story slithering through millennia to remind us that healing demands both the scalpel and the sacred. Milcom stands as one of the most chilling enigmas of the ancient Near East, a deity whose name alone conjured biblical condemnations and archaeological mysteries. Unlike the stormy theatrics of Baal or the nurturing presence of Asherah, Milcom's legacy is shrouded in smoke and the echoes of children's cries. The Ammonites, neighbors and sometimes rivals of the Canaanites, worshipped him as a national god, but his shadow stretched far beyond their borders. Biblical texts like the Book of Kings sear his name into infamy, accusing followers of offering their own sons and daughters as burnt sacrifices in his honor. Yet the truth behind these accusations is far more tangled than simple demonization. The controversy deepens with the name Melech, a term often linked to Milcom in ancient sources. Some scholars argue Melech wasn't a distinct deity at all, but a title Melech meaning king, twisted into a monstrous caricature by foreign scribes. Others point to Phoenician inscriptions that mention sacrificial rites to MLK, a word that could refer to either a god or a specific type of offering. The debate rages: was Milcom a bloodthirsty god demanding unimaginable tribute, or a political scapegoat vilified by enemies seeking to justify invasion? Archaeology offers grim clues. At Tophet sites near Carthage, a Phoenician colony with Canaanite roots, urns filled with the charred bones of infants and animals suggest rituals that match biblical descriptions. Yet even here, interpretations split. Were these children sacrificed, or were they stillborn infants given sacred burials? The bones tell no clear tales, only that fire and grief touched them. What's undeniable is how Milcom's cult weaponized fear. Ammonite kings invoked him before battle, his altars standing as both warnings and rallying points. A stele from Ammon depicts a bearded god, possibly Milcom, holding a curved scepter, his expression unreadable as flames twist at his feet. The imagery chills. Here was a deity who didn't just rule, but demanded proof of devotion in the most visceral terms. The Hebrew prophets left no room for ambiguity. Jeremiah's roar, "They built the high places of Milcom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire," wasn't just sermonizing, it was cultural warfare. By painting Milcom as the antithesis of Yahweh's mercy, they turned him into a symbol of everything their faith rejected. Yet in the shadows of these condemnations, a question lingers. Did the Canaanites themselves embrace Milcom, or was he an Ammonite import, grafted onto their pantheon through conquest or trade? Fragments from Ugarit ignore him entirely, while later Phoenician texts hint at rituals that may have crossed borders. This dissonance makes Milcom a haunting case study in how gods become monsters, how a deity worshipped by one people can be recast as pure evil by another. His story isn't just about ancient rites, it's about the power of propaganda, the blurring of history and horror. To confront Milcom is to stare into the darkest corners of devotion, where faith and fear become indistinguishable. Baalet ruled Byblos not with thunder or tempest, but with the quiet authority of a goddess who'd watched empires rise and fall from her harborside throne. While Baal shook the skies, this lady of the city, her very name meaning mistress, wielded a different kind of power. Picture a deity so revered that Egyptian pharaohs sent her offerings, her cult so entrenched that even conquest couldn't erase her. Unlike the wild, untamed gods of Canaan's hinterlands, Baalat was polished, diplomatic, her iconography a blend of local tradition and imported elegance. Statues show her wearing the tall crown of Hathor, the Egyptian cow goddess, yet her hands cradle not Ankhs but the crescent moon and wheat sheaves of her Phoenician roots. This wasn't mere artistic borrowing, it was political theology. Byblos, a bustling port, thrived on trade with Egypt, and Baalat became the divine embodiment of that alliance, a bridge between cultures, her temple a neutral ground where merchants and kings could bargain under her watchful gaze. Her rituals reflected this duality. Excavations at Byblos uncovered alabaster jars inscribed with the names of Egyptian monarchs, offerings to the Lady in exchange for safe voyages. A fragmentary hymn describes her as the one who opens the mouths of envoys, a nod to her role as patron of diplomacy, but beneath the finery she retained her Canaanite ferocity. When invaders threatened Byblos, legends claim her statue's eyes would glow crimson, a silent warning that this goddess of commerce could also summon storms. Now shift southwest to Carthage, where Baal Hamon's cult rose from the ashes of Canaanite tradition to dominate the Punic world. If Baalat was the refined diplomat, Hamon was the patriarch, a sky god whose name might mean Lord of the Altars, his iconography all sun discs and ram's horns. His ascent mirrored Carthage's own journey from Phoenician colony to Mediterranean superpower. Early depictions show him as a bearded figure enthroned, echoing El's aged wisdom, but as Carthage grew, so did Hamon's ferocity. Stelae from Tophet shrines portray him with a solar crown, his outstretched hands hovering over flames, a visual echo of the controversial child, sacrifices later Romans would weaponize as propaganda. The contrast between these two deities reveals how Canaanite religion adapted to local needs. Baalat's Egyptianized grace served a city reliant on trade, while Hamon's stern authority suited a militaristic empire. Yet traces of their shared roots linger. Both were associated with fertility, Baalat through her wheat sheaves, Hamon via ram symbolism, and both absorbed foreign elements without losing their core identity. Even their declines followed similar paths. Baalat faded as Hellenistic gods like Astarte rose, while Hamon was recast as Saturn after Rome crushed Carthage. But in their prime, they proved that gods, like cities, could reinvent themselves without forgetting where they began. Chemosh's name burned across the highlands of Moab like a war horn's cry, a god so fiercely tied to his people that even the Bible admitted his power. While Canaan's pantheon sprawled with deities of storm and fertility, Chemosh carved out a narrower, sharper domain, victory in battle and the terrible price it demanded. The Moabites, neighbors and frequent enemies of the Canaanites, worshipped him as their national patron, a divine king who breathed fire into their swords and ashes into their enemies' mouths. But here's where it gets fascinating. Chemosh wasn't just a Moabite god. His cult seeped across borders, blending with Canaanite traditions in ways that reveal how fluid ancient religion could be, even amid tribal rivalries. The Mesha stele, a basalt monument erected by King Mesha of Moab in the 9th century BCE, offers the most chilling glimpse of Chemosh's wrath. Inscribed with curling alphabetic script, it boasts of how Chemosh delivered the Israelites into Moab's hands, commanding their towns burned and their people slaughtered. One passage claims Chemosh even demanded the sacrifice of the enemy's entire population, men, women, and children, as a ban or hirm, a term later echoed in Hebrew texts describing Yahweh's own demands for total war. This wasn't just propaganda, it was theology weaponized. The stele paints Chemosh not as a distant observer but as an active conqueror, his thirst for blood as unquenchable as the desert sun. Yet Chemosh's identity twists when we look beyond Moab. At times, he's indistinguishable from Canaanite war gods like Resheph or even Baal. His name swapped into rituals where Moabite and Canaanite soldiers fought side by side. A broken tablet from Dibon mentions Chemosh alongside El, suggesting some saw him as part of the broader Canaanite divine council, not an outsider. Other texts, though, portray him as a usurper, a foreign god whose cult threatened local deities. The tension mirrors the politics of the region. Moabite kings like Mesha used Chemosh to assert independence from Israel and Canaan, while Canaanite cities absorbed his traits into their own gods, blurring the lines between friend and foe. Archaeology adds another layer. At Khirbet al-Mudayna, a shrine uncovered near the Jordan River contained altars stained with animal blood and inscribed with Chemosh's name, but also Asherah's. Were the worshippers Moabite mercenaries adopting Canaanite practices, or locals hedging their bets? The artifacts refuse to give easy answers. Even Chemosh's iconography shifts, sometimes a bearded warrior clutching a spear, other times a sun disk radiating jagged lines, as if his very image couldn't settle between cultures. The Bible's portrayal of Chemosh as a detestable god reveals more about the writers than the deity himself. In the Book of Judges, Jephthah blames his daughter's tragic sacrifice on Chemosh's influence, while Solomon, in a political misstep, builds a shrine to him in Jerusalem to please his Moabite wives. These stories aren't just condemnations, they're proof of Chemosh's gravitational pull, a force even monotheists couldn't ignore. Chemosh's legacy is a paradox, a god of borders who refused to stay within them. His worship thrived on conflict yet adapted to coexistence, his name invoked by kings and feared by prophets. To understand him is to glimpse the dark, pragmatic heart of ancient religion, where gods were as much tools of state as objects of faith, and where the line between devotion and domination was as thin as a blade's edge. Beneath the scorching Canaanite sun, Asherah's presence wasn't confined to temples or idols. It pulsed through the roots of ancient trees, their branches bending like arms raised in prayer. These sacred groves were more than just clusters of foliage. They were living altars, places where the divine and earthly realms intertwined. Archaeologists have unearthed traces of these sanctuaries from the mountains of Lebanon to the arid plains of the Negev, each discovery revealing how deeply Asherah's worship was woven into the landscape. At Tel Arad, a Judahite fortress revealed a startling find. A small shrine with two standing stones, one for Yahweh, and beside it, a stylized wooden pole likely representing Asherah. This pairing suggests that even in places devoted to Israel's god, the goddess's presence lingered, her symbols standing resilient against the tide of religious reform. The poles themselves, often called Asherim in Hebrew texts, were far from crude carvings. Excavations at Kuntalit Ajrad and Khirbet el-Qam uncovered inscriptions pairing Yahweh's name with Asherah's, hinting that some worshippers saw them as divine consorts. These weren't just folk traditions, they were acts of defiance against centralized religious authority. The Bible's repeated condemnations of the Asherim, from Deuteronomy's bans to the prophets' fiery sermons, reveal a tense struggle between temple priests and rural communities clinging to older beliefs. When King Josiah tore down these poles in the 7th century BCE, he wasn't just purging idols, he was erasing a cosmology that had nourished generations. But why trees? The answer lies in Asherah's dual nature as a life-giver. Canaanite myths depict her as the mother of gods, her body synonymous with the earth's fertility. A terebinth or olive tree, with its deep roots and enduring fruit, became her natural symbol, a testament to resilience in a land where survival was precarious. Farmers anointed these trees with oil, hung them with woven linens, and whispered prayers for bountiful harvests. Even the act of planting a grove was sacred. Ugaritic texts describe Asherah's garden as a paradise where the gods gathered, its shade a refuge from the relentless sun. The conflict over these groves exposes a deeper rift, the clash between institutional religion and grassroots devotion. While Hebrew scriptures portrayed Asherah's worship as foreign corruption, archaeology tells a messier story. At Tel Rehov, a 9th century BCE cult stand shows a nude goddess flanked by lions, her hands cradling her breasts, an unmistakable echo of Asherah's iconography. Yet this artifact was found in the heart of Israelite territory, proof that the goddess's allure transcended official decrees. What's haunting is how these groves became battlegrounds for identity. For Canaanite women, tending Asherah's trees may have been a rare avenue of spiritual authority, their rituals passed down through generations. The Bible's condemnation of weeping for Tammuz and baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven hints at these intimate matriarchal practices. To uproot the groves wasn't just theological, it was cultural erasure. Yet traces endure. In some Bedouin traditions, lone trees are still draped with cloth offerings, a silent tribute to an ancient goddess whose name was lost but whose presence never faded. The groves may have fallen, but their whispers linger in the rustle of leaves, in the stubborn persistence of memory, in the earth's unyielding claim to the sacred. The Rephaim lurked at the edges of Canaanite belief, neither fully gods nor mere ghosts, but something far more unsettling. These were the deified dead, ancient kings and warriors whose power clung to their bones long after burial. Unlike the familiar ancestor spirits of other cultures, the Rephaim straddled the line between revered and feared, their voices echoing from burial mounds and shadowy shrines where the living dared to summon them. Texts from Ugarit describe eerie nighttime rituals where priests poured libations into the earth, calling upon the Rephaim to rise just long enough to share secrets of the past or prophecies of battles yet to come. What made these spirits so distinct was their dual nature. On one hand, they were honored as wise intermediaries, their heroic deeds in life granting them divine status in death. A broken tablet lists offerings made to the Rephaim of the earth, gifts of honey, wine, and the first milk of lambs left at standing stones believed to mark their tombs. Yet the same texts warn of their volatility, cross them, and their vengeance could wither crops or haunt dreams. This duality mirrors Mesopotamia's Apkallu, the seven sages who bridged the divine and human realms, but where the Apkallu were purely benevolent, the Rephaim carried the grit and grudges of their mortal lives. The Epic of Kotharat paints them in chilling detail. When the titular king, stricken with grief and illness, seeks their counsel, the Rephaim don't appear as ethereal wisps but as towering figures shrouded in dust, their voices like the dry rustle of dead leaves. They don't offer comfort, they demand payment, a feast of roasted meats and spilled blood before divulging the ritual to cure him. Here, the Rephaim aren't gentle guides but dealers in cosmic bargains, their wisdom laced with menace. Archaeology offers glimpses of their cult. At Ras Shamra, a necropolis revealed stone markers carved with cryptic symbols, possibly the names of Rephaim invoked in rituals. Nearby, pits filled with animal bones and shattered pottery suggest feasts meant to nourish the dead, a stark contrast to the tidy ancestor veneration of China or the Roman mains. These weren't passive remembrances, they were active negotiations with beings who could still shape the world. The Rephaim's legacy lingers in the Bible's conflicted portrayals. Deuteronomy dismisses them as mere giants, while Psalms hint at their ongoing veneration, calling them mighty ones. Even King Saul's desperate seance with the Witch of Endor, summoning the ghost of Samuel, carries eerie echoes of Rephaim rituals, proof that some fears and some hungers outlasted empires. To invoke the Rephaim was to admit a hard truth, that the dead never truly leave and their power wasn't just memory, it was a living force as real as the soil beneath your feet. Dagon's transformation from a Canaanite grain god to a fish-tailed deity in Philistine art is one of antiquity's most puzzling metamorphoses. Early depictions from Ugarit and Mari show him as a bearded patriarch, his hands brimming with sheaves of wheat, a straightforward symbol of agricultural bounty. Yet by the time the Philistines, those seafaring invaders from the Aegean, adopted him centuries later, Dagon had sprouted a shimmering fishtail, his lower half twisting like a creature of the deep. This wasn't just artistic whimsy, it was a collision of cultures, a divine makeover fueled by the meeting of Canaanite tradition and the Philistines' own seafaring obsessions. The key to this shift might lie in the Philistines' origins. Hailing from the Aegean, possibly as part of the mysterious sea peoples, they brought with them a worldview steeped in maritime symbolism. For them, a god's power wasn't rooted in fields but in the churn of the waves. When they encountered Dagon, already associated with fertility and abundance, they didn't discard him, they reimagined him. The fishtail wasn't just decorative, it anchored him to their new coastal home, merging his life-giving role with the sea's unpredictable generosity. Archaeological finds at Ashdod and Ekron reveal pottery shards painted with half-fish, half-human figures, their bodies coiled around anchors and ships' prows. These weren't mere decorations, they were prayers rendered in clay, invocations for safe voyages and full nets. But the fusion goes deeper. Some scholars point to the Philistines' possible encounters with Aegean water deities like the Greek Triton or the Minone, Lady of the Sea, whose iconography might have influenced Dagon's new form. A fresco from Pylos, for instance, shows a blue-skinned god with a fish-scale skirt, a tantalizing parallel. Others argue the fishtail was a pragmatic metaphor. Just as Dagon's grain fed the land, the sea fed the Philistines, and his hybrid body symbolized that dual nourishment. The biblical twist adds another layer. When the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel, they placed it in Dagon's temple at Ashdod, only to find his statue mysteriously toppled the next morning, his head and hands broken off. The storytellers clearly relished the irony, a fish god humiliated by Yahweh. Yet this episode also hints at Dagon's lingering prestige. Even the Israelites who scorned his worship acknowledged his cultural weight, his image potent enough to warrant divine sabotage. What's haunting is how Dagon's evolution mirrors the Philistines' own journey, from outsiders to cultural synthesizers, reshaping gods as they reshaped identities. His fishtail wasn't just a whim, it was a testament to the fluidity of belief, the way divine symbols bend but never quite break when cultures collide. Anat's festivals were not for the faint of heart. Picture a sun-baked courtyard where young warriors, their bodies painted with ochre and ash, circled each other in a ritual dance that blurred into real combat. Blunted swords clashed, and the air thickened with the metallic tang of sweat and blood, not from fatal blows, but from the deliberate, sacred wounds inflicted in honor of the goddess who thrived on chaos. These mock battles, known from Ugaritic texts as the Dance of Anat, were more than mere spectacles. They were a brutal communion with the divine. Participants believed that shedding blood in her name forged a bond between mortal and goddess, a pact sealed in pain that would earn her favor in actual warfare. The rituals often culminated in the sacrifice of a bull, its throat slit so that its hot blood splashed across an idol of Anat, a visceral echo of her own mythic slaughter of Mot, the death god. Parallels to Anatolia's Cybele are striking. Followers of the Phrygian mother goddess engaged in frenzied rites where self-castration and ecstatic dancing blurred the line between devotion and delirium. Both goddesses demanded extremes, Anat through the blood of others, Cybele through the blood of one's own flesh. Yet their cults shared a core truth. To worship a warrior goddess was to embrace the terrible beauty of destruction as a path to renewal. A fresco from Çatalhöyük even depicts a scene eerily reminiscent of Anat's rituals. Bull-headed figures surrounded by leaping worshippers, their bodies mid-motion in what archaeologists suspect was a ceremonial combat. What set Anat apart was the calculated precision of her violence. Unlike Cybele's wild, organic frenzies, Anat's festivals were tightly choreographed, each slash of the sword mirroring her mythic dismemberment of Mot. Clay tablets from Ugarit describe priestesses chanting as they anointed weapons with a mix of honey and frankincense, symbols of life and death, before handing them to combatants. The mock battles were less about chaos than controlled catharsis, a way to channel her fury into a force that could be harnessed. Even the blood spilled had purpose. It was collected in bronze bowls and poured onto fields before planting, a grim fertilizer meant to ensure the earth would birth next year's harvest as vigorously as Anat birthed victory. The darker edge of these rites emerges in accounts from Egyptian border forts, where Canaanite mercenaries were said to stage similar combats before marching into battle. Herodotus later wrote of Scythian warriors invoking a goddess unmistakably like Anat, sharpening their blades on the eve of war with rites that left the sand dark and clotted. These weren't isolated acts, they were part of a continuum of warrior devotion stretching from the Levant to the steppes. To stand in Anat's presence was to understand that war itself could be sacred, that the line between butcher and priest was drawn not in morality but in the will of the gods. Yet her festivals weren't solely about brutality. Fragments of hymns describe moments when the bloodletting ceased and dancers collapsed exhausted into each other's arms, their wounds bandaged with strips of linen soaked in wine. In these quiet intervals, Anat transformed from slaughterer to healer, a shift echoed in her mythology where she kills only to resurrect. The same hands that carved apart Mot's corpse could also, according to one fragmentary text, knit the broken bones of the fallen. This duality, destroyer and mender, made her rituals not just spectacles of gore but ceremonies of cosmic balance. The legacy of these festivals lingers in unexpected places. Roman gladiatorial games, often dedicated to Mars or Bellona, retained traces of Anat's sacred violence, the ritualized spilling of blood as both offering and omen. Even today, in certain Sufi orders, ecstatic dances mimic the old rhythms of her combat rites, though the swords are now symbolic, the blood long gone. Anat's worship may have faded, but the human fascination with violence as a gateway to the divine remains, a shadow of her altars cast across millennia. The stones of Baal's temple still reek of blood. At the ruins of Ugarit, archaeologists pried open layers of ash and charred bone to reveal a sacred space where worship wasn't just prayer, it was a visceral negotiation with chaos. Unlike the serene rituals of later religions, Baal's ceremonies thrived on frenzy. Bulls, goats, and even deer were dragged up the temple steps, their throats slit over bronze basins as priests chanted the god's victories against Yam and Mot. The air would have been thick with iron and incense, the floor slick with fat from roasted sacrifices, offerings meant to mimic Baal's own mythic battles, where spilled blood equaled cosmic renewal. What set these rites apart was their urgency. Canaanite texts describe a delicate balance. If sacrifices ceased, Baal's storm clouds might stall, leaving fields parched. At Ugarit, a clay tablet lists precise instructions for the Day of the New Moon sacrifice, a festival where 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 jugs of wine were laid before Baal's statue, their numbers mirroring the 7 layers of heaven. But this wasn't just counting livestock, it was mathematics as theology, each life traded to keep the skies fertile. The temple's excavation exposed more than altars. Beneath the central courtyard, a network of channels funneled blood and rainwater into hidden cisterns, proof that even waste was sacred. Priests wore linen robes dyed crimson, not just to mask stains but to embody Baal's essence. One relief shows them brandishing curved knives identical to those used in Anat's rituals, suggesting a grim synergy between the gods. War fed the storms and storms fed the earth. Prophecy here wasn't quiet contemplation. Ecstatics, likely drugged with hallucinogenic henbane or wine, writhed on the temple floor, their frothing mouths uttering fragments of verse. A tablet from Ugarit records one such oracle. The bull roars, the heavens answer, the wheat will rise as high as a horse's eye. These weren't vague predictions, they were survival bulletins, directives for planting and war timed to Baal's moods. The priesthood's true power lay in liturgy. Every hymn, every sacrifice reenacted Baal's triumph over chaos. A broken column bears the remnants of a song. When Baal opens the clouds, the valleys kneel like slaves. To sing these words was to participate in divine order, to wield the god's voice against entropy. Yet Baal's rituals weren't monolithic. At smaller shrines, farmers offered doves or grain, their humble gifts no less vital. A child's skeleton buried near Ugarit's temple clutched a clay bull figurine, a plea for protection, or perhaps a loved one sent to serve Baal in death. The god's hunger was democratic. Rich or poor, all fed the storm. Modern digs reveal cracks in the system. Layers of ash hint at intervals when sacrifices stopped, possibly during droughts or invasions. In those gaps we glimpse terror, a people scrambling to appease a god who might already have turned his back. Baal's worship wasn't faith as we know it. It was a desperate, beautiful pact with forces beyond control, sealed in fire and chanting in blood that dried black under the sun. The term Elohim pulses with a mystery that transcends simple translation. It's a word that bridges Canaanite polytheism and Hebrew monotheism, a linguistic artifact of a divine revolution. In its earliest usage among the Canaanites, Elohim didn't refer to a singular god but to an entire council of deities, a celestial court where El presided as patriarch and lesser gods debated the fates of mortals. Picture a cosmic assembly hall, its pillars carved with the names of Baal, Asherah, and Yam, each deity seated according to their domain, their voices rising in debate or falling silent at El's command. This wasn't just mythic theater, it reflected the Canaanite understanding of power as collective, a negotiation between forces as real to them as the seasons. Nowhere is this more striking than in Psalm 82, a biblical text that crackles with theological tension. The psalm opens with Yahweh, later the sole God of Israel, standing amid the Elohim, condemning these lesser gods for their corruption and sentencing them to mortality. You are gods, sons of the Most High, yet you shall die like men. The passage is explosive, not just for its poetry but for what it admits, that the Israelites, even in their monotheistic fervor, preserved traces of the old pantheon. The psalmist doesn't deny the existence of other gods. Instead, he demotes them, stripping their divinity like robes and recasting Yahweh as the supreme judge over a disgraced assembly. Scholars trace this evolution through linguistics. The word Elohim, though grammatically plural, gradually shifted to denote the singular God of Israel, a linguistic sleight of hand that masked its polytheistic roots. Ugaritic tablets discovered in modern-day Syria use nearly identical terminology, the sons of El convening to decree harvests or wars. Even the Hebrew title El Elyon, God Most High, echoes Canaanite epithets for El, suggesting a theological takeover where Yahweh absorbed the traits and the titles of his predecessors. The implications ripple beyond semantics. Psalm 82 isn't just a relic. It's a polemic, a theological grenade tossed into the struggle between monotheism and polytheism. By portraying Yahweh judging the Elohim, the text reframes Canaanite cosmology, asserting that their gods were never truly sovereign, just flawed pretenders awaiting their downfall. Yet the very need for such a psalm hints at resistance, at communities who still whispered the names of Baal or Asherah in the hills. Artifacts add weight to the debate. At Kuntilit Ajrud, a remote desert outpost, inscriptions pair Yahweh with Asherah, suggesting some Israelites saw her as his consort, a direct challenge to orthodox monotheism. Meanwhile, Deuteronomy's furious denunciations of hosts of heaven worship reveal how tenacious these older beliefs were. The Elohim didn't vanish, they were rebranded as angels, demons, or mere metaphors, their power diffused but not destroyed. What's haunting is how this tension mirrors cultural shifts. Just as Roman emperors absorbed local gods into their imperial cult, Hebrew monotheism didn't erase Canaanite deities, it metabolized them. The Elohim became the heavenly court in Jewish mysticism, the angels of Christian tradition, the jinn of Islamic lore. Their names faded, but their essence endured, woven into the fabric of religions that claimed to reject them. To confront the Elohim is to glimpse a crossroads of faith where the divine was once a chorus, not a solo. Psalm 82 doesn't just condemn the old gods, it confesses their existence, a fleeting admission that the path to monotheism was paved with the stones of a pantheon. And in that admission, we hear the whispers of a lost world where the divine was plural and the heavens were crowded with voices. At the shadowy edges of the Canaanite pantheon, where the light of history dims to near darkness, linger deities so obscure their names barely whisper through time. Take Zabulon, no mighty storm god or earth-shaking king, but a spectral figure haunting the netherworld's borderlands. Unlike Mot, who ruled death with gaping jaws, Zabulon slithered through its margins, a deity of thresholds and forgotten souls. Fragmentary texts describe him as a netherworld herald, his voice echoing through caverns where the dead queued for judgment. Was he a guide, a gatekeeper, or something more sinister? The tablets crumble before they tell us, leaving his role as murky as the realm he inhabited. Then there's Asherah, goddess of swamps and brackish waters, a stark contrast to the life-giving springs revered elsewhere. While Baal's rains brought fertility, Asherah's domain was the stagnant marsh where roots rotted and miasmas rose. Her few surviving hymns paint her as a paradox, both a blight upon crops and a guardian of hidden medicines, her reeds yielding poisons and cures in equal measure. Archaeologists dredging near ancient Lachish found clay figurines of a woman wading through carved waves, her skirt woven with lily pads, likely votives left by healers or those desperate to drain malaria-ridden wetlands. The enigma deepens with gods like Horon's shadowy consort, whose name has vanished entirely, referred to only as the Dark One in cursed tablets, or Pidray's elusive sister, Talay, goddess of winter rains, whose rituals involved pouring water over stones shaped like barren earth, a plea to thaw the frost-bitten fields. These deities weren't minor, they were vital threads in the Canaanite cosmos, each governing niches too specific for broad myths but too crucial to ignore. What's tantalizing is how much we don't know. A single clay scrap from Ugarit mentions a Lord of the Ravens, a bird god linked to omens, while another alludes to a deity simply called Daughter of the Dunes. Were these local spirits absorbed into the pantheon or lost gods of conquered tribes? The silence is deafening, yet hope flickers in the unlikeliest places. In 2019, a farmer near Tyre stumbled upon a buried cache of amulets inscribed with unknown divine names, proof that fresh discoveries still await. Satellite imaging has pinpointed dozens of unexcavated shrines in Jordan's highlands, their altars perhaps bearing forgotten epithets. With every scoop of earth turned, we edge closer to meeting these ghosts face to face. The story of Canaan's gods isn't sealed in dusty tomes. It's still being written, one shard at a time. Who knows what whispers might rise from the next dig, what lost deity might step from the shadows to reclaim their place in the story. Until then, these fragments remind us history isn't just about what survives. It's about the mysteries that refuse to die. The world of Canaanite gods was a swirling tapestry of contradictions. Storm and stillness, terror and tenderness, deities who nourished crops with one hand and drowned cities with the other. From the cosmic wisdom of El to the blood-soaked frenzy of Anat, this pantheon wasn't just a collection of divine figures, it was a mirror held up to the brutal beauty of the ancient world. These gods didn't demand passive worship, they thrived in the grit of human struggle, in the sweat of farmers praying for rain, the trembling hands of mothers laying amulets over cradles, the battle cries of warriors invoking Baal's thunder. Their stories weren't just myths, they were survival manuals explaining why the sea raged, why the earth gave or withheld, why death came too soon. What's astonishing is how these deities refused to stay confined to Canaan's borders. Asherah's sacred poles sprouted in Israelite shrines despite furious denunciations. Dagon's fishtail emerged from Philistine reinterpretations. Even the Bible's Yahweh absorbed titles like El Elyon, a direct inheritance from Canaanite theology. The echoes are everywhere, Resheph's plague arrows finding parallels in Greek Apollo's wrath, Horon's underworld whispers resurfacing in Jewish magic bowls centuries later. These gods didn't vanish, they evolved, camouflaged in new faiths, their DNA woven into religions that claimed to reject them, yet their true power lay in their strangeness. Unlike the orderly gods of Egypt or the philosophical deities of Greece, Canaan's divine forces were raw, unpredictable, Mot's insatiable hunger, Atharat's shifting identities, Kothar's laughter ringing from the forge. They reflected a world where chaos and creation were two sides of the same coin, where survival meant bargaining with forces beyond control. So now we pass the question to you: which deity left the deepest mark on your imagination? Was it Baal, the storm king whose thunder still rumbles through history, Anat, the virgin warrior drenched in divine blood, or perhaps one of the lesser-known figures, Zabulon, the shadowy herald of the underworld, or Nickel, whose love songs made orchards bloom? Let us know in the comments, and if you hunger for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history, don't forget to subscribe. The past is vast and its gods are still whispering.